The Subcommittee on Energy. Wait a second. My mic has come apart. What do you think? Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources will come to order. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us, whether in person and virtually. Welcome to our subcommittee. Ranking Member Stauber, it's always great to see you, and it's nice to sit next to you.
Likewise, Mr. Chair.
And I would like to welcome the newest member of our committee, but I don't see her at this moment, somebody I served with in California. Ms. Connie Conway, I'll mention that again if she arrives, but a pleasure to work with. Subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on 4 bills that cover a range of issues: the collection and use of geospatial data, geothermal energy development, and protecting wildlife corridors and tribal cultural sites in central New Mexico. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designee. This will allow us to hear from witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or at the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. Without objection, the member from Idaho, Representative Fulcher, the member from New Mexico, Representative Stansbury, and the member from Florida, Representative Soto, are authorized to question the witnesses in today's hearing. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Members physically present should provide a hard copy for staff to distribute by email. Please note that members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our fully in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. With that, I'll begin my opening statement. I want to emphasize the bipartisan, practical nature of the legislation that we're considering today, and thank my colleagues across the aisle for working with us on this hearing and these bills. 2 of the bills today, on today's hearing, address the collection and use of geospatial data. Whether transporting goods more efficiently, mapping disease outbreaks, getting driving directions on your smartphone, or predicting when natural disasters might occur, accurate and easily accessible geospatial data is fundamental in our modern world. Geospatial data also helps us to make our land management decisions. It helps determine the quantity and quality of water, of mineral, and energy resources. And it helps conserve our natural and cultural heritage. The Federal Land Asset Inventory Reform Act, or the FLAIR Act, introduced by Mr. Kind and Ranking Member Westerman, directs the Department of the Interior to develop and maintain an up-to-date, centralized inventory of federal property to assist in better managing our public lands. The federal government does not, and I emphasize that, does not have a current, accurate inventory of all the land that it owns. The General Accountability Office has cited issues with the management of federal property several times since 2003, and in 2007, a National Academies of Science report detailed how the Department of the Interior used over 100 different land management systems across multiple agencies. Not much has improved over the last 70 years when it comes to the Department of Interior's management of their geospatial data. The FLAIR Act is one potential remedy for this problem. And I hope I'm pronouncing geospatial correctly. Geospatial data is also helpful to government officials, to emergency responders, and to landowners when they're assessing how vulnerable an area is to deadly and destructive natural hazards. The prevention of natural hazards is especially relevant to Mr. Soto's Sinkhole Mapping Act of 2021, which directs the U.S. Geological Survey to create a program studying the causes of sinkholes and to develop maps of areas at greatest risk. The importance of this geospatial data for protecting communities and making land management decisions cannot be understated. We have two other bills on our agenda today. H.R. 5350, Mr. Fulcher's Enhancing Geothermal Production on Federal Lands Act, and this addresses one of my personally favorite topics, which is expanding clean energy on public lands. Geothermal was the first type of renewable energy projects to be permitted on public lands back in 1978, but it still has enormous potential for responsible expansions. Well, I'd like to see a few changes to the bill. We must be doing more to increase development and level the playing field for geothermal on public lands, and this bill offers some very creative ideas for discussion today. Lastly, but certainly not least, H.R. 5805, Representative Stansbury's Buffalo Tract Protection Act, addresses the concerns of communities and tribes that are impacted by gravel mining on BLM lands in Sandoval County, New Mexico. In 2012, BLM's Rio Puerto field office issued a draft resource management plan that would allow additional gravel mining in the area, which is already negatively impacted by air and water quality issues from existing mine sites nearby. This area also contains important cultural heritage and key wildlife migration corridors. This bill would withdraw a few small parcels of land from development and would permanently protect the health of local tribes and communities, as well as the resources they depend upon. I look forward to the discussion of these bills, and I now recognize Ranking Member Stauber for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and once again, it is great to be back in person with you. Today, the subcommittee will hear testimony on 4 bills. HR 5350, the Enhancing Geothermal Production on Federal Lands Act, sponsored by my friend and neighbor on the full committee dais and the ranking member of the Public Lands Subcommittee, Russ Fulcher, is a crucial step towards our goal of a truly all-of-the-above domestic energy strategy. Geothermal energy is a reliable, renewable energy source. However, like just every other reliable resource, it's bogged down by a multi-year, inefficient, and litigation-centric permitting process. A large amount of our domestic geothermal resources is located on federal lands, meaning permit applications can languish for years at the Bureau of Land Management field offices. This bill streamlines approval for the geothermal test sites and directs the Secretary of the Interior to designate priority areas for geothermal energy development. Again, any serious consideration of, quote, renewable, end quote, energy requires a diverse portfolio, which includes geothermal energy alongside nuclear, hydro, and more. Using steam from the Earth's crust can't be more sustainable. It's a valuable resource to help us diversify our energy, and we desperately need to make the permitting process easier. And we are blessed to have 90% of America's geothermal resources on federal lands. To my friends and colleagues, this is an issue we can fix together. I am an original co-sponsor of the Enhancing Geothermal Production on Federal Lands Act. As ranking member of Energy and Minerals Resources, I want to see this bill become law. Next, we will also consider H.R. 5522, the Federal Lands Asset Inventory Reform Act, or the FLAIR Act, sponsored by Representative Kind and co-sponsored by Ranking Member Westerman, which requires DOI to develop and maintain a single inventory of federally owned lands. The federal government owns vast amounts of property, including government buildings, but there is no existing method to maintain a streamlined catalog of assets. To solve this, the FLAIR Act creates an updated, publicly available, and easily searchable database to inventory all real property assets to support land management. Next, we have H.R. 3681, the Sinkhole Mapping Act of 2019, sponsored by Representative Soto. This legislation creates a program to study the short and long-term causes of sinkholes and requires the U.S. Geological Survey to develop maps of higher risk areas for sinkhole information. Last, H.R. 5805, sponsored by Representative Stansbury, would permanently withdraw almost 4,288 acres of land from mineral development in New Mexico, putting sand, gravel, and aggregates off limits. The estimated 36 million cubic yards of sand and gravel in the proposed withdrawal area is a significant loss to the region, especially as the population of Albuquerque is expected to double over the next 3 decades. Last week, this committee discussed proposals to ban taconite from a huge region of the Iron Range in northern Minnesota, which is an irreplaceable mineral for construction. This week, we continue shooting ourselves in the foot as a nation by now banning a needed sand and gravel resource, which increased in value by 6%. I'd like to again reference how candidate Biden pledged to use domestic miners, but now as president, he prefers going abroad for our critical minerals. How does the majority intend to build basic infrastructure in this nation, let alone ease supply chain concerns for precious metals? This majority passed a massive infrastructure package, and Joe Biden's 9.1% inflation is already requiring project triage. Proposals like banning taconite or aggregate development will only make this worse. We will not be able to keep up in places that are growing like the Albuquerque area. I would like to enter a letter in opposition to H.R. 5805 into the record from the National Stone, Sand, and Gravel Association. Meanwhile, I am pleased that we have Mr. Mike Ned joining us today from the BLM. The Bureau has continued to slow walk the administration of the onshore oil and gas leasing program, ignoring the requirement in the Mineral Leasing Act to conduct quarterly lease sales. To date, the Bureau has only held one round of lease sales, which finally occurred 1.5 years into the Biden administration. the BLM should have conducted 6 rounds of lease sales on federal lands by now, meaning the Bureau is now a full 5 quarters out of compliance with the Mineral Leasing Act. Although this truly is no longer surprising, after all, Joe Biden did promise to ban fossil fuels. Instead of traveling to Saudi Arabia to beg for their oil, there are actions the administration can take right now to get America back on track towards energy independence. Maybe Joe Biden should head back next week and beg Saudi Arabia for aggregates and taconite while he's at it. Regardless, the Bureau must convey the leases won as a result of the June lease sales and begin work on the next round immediately for the future sales. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
You, Ranking Member, for your opening statement. We have 2 panels today, and I'm going to introduce our first panel, panel 1, and our witness is Mr. Mike Ned. Mike is the Deputy Director for Operations at the Bureau of Land Management. Mr. Ned, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Sauber, and members of the subcommittee. I am Michael Ned, the Bureau of Land Management's Deputy Director for Operations. I am pleased to be here to provide testimony on 3 bills on today's agenda of interest to the BLM. The Bureau of Land Management manages approximately 245 million surface acres located primarily in the 12 western states, as well as 30% of the nation's onshore mineral resources of 700 million subsurface acres under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, or FLPMA. The Bureau's core mission of multiple use and sustained yield provides for a careful balance across many uses and resources in our stewardship of the public lands for all people. The Bureau manages public lands for a broad range of uses, such as renewable and conventional energy development, livestock grazing, timber production, hunting, fishing, recreation, wilderness, and conservation, including protecting cultural and historical resources. Land managed by the BLM also provide vital habitat for more than 3,000 species of wildlife and support fisheries in exceptional regional and national value. The bills under consideration today includes proposals that align with important administration priorities, including expediting renewable energy development on public lands, promoting locally led conservation efforts, and delivering better service to our customers. We appreciate the work of the sponsors and the subcommittee on these measures and look forward to continuing to work with you on them. H.R. 5350, the Enhancing Geothermal Production on Federal Land Act, amends the Geothermal Steam Act of 1970 by creating a new categorical exclusion for geothermal test project on federal geothermal leases. The bill would also create new geothermal leasing priority area. The efficient development of renewable energy from our nation's public lands is crucial in achieving the Biden administration goal of a carbon pollution-free power sector by 2035, as well as direction in the Energy Policy Act of 2020 to permit 25 gigawatt of solar, wind, and geothermal production on public land by 2025. The BLM supports the goal of H.R. 5350 to enhance and improve permitting for responsible geothermal energy production on public land. We would like to work with the sponsors on technical assistance relating to the proposed categorical exclusion and the geothermal leasing priority areas outlined in the bill. H.R. 5522, the Federal Land Asset Inventory Reform Act, directs the department to develop and maintain a multi-purpose registry of all federal real property assets and eliminate duplicate data system across the federal government. The BLM is working to update and modernize its land ownership information system, and we support the provision of the bill that align with those efforts. We would like to work with the sponsor to address concerns related to the scope and timeframe outlined in the bill. H.R. 5805, the Buffalo Tract Protection Act, would redraw approximately 4,200 acres containing 4 parcels of BLM land near Placitas, New Mexico, from all form of mineral development under all law pertaining to locatable minerals, mineral leasing, and mineral material. The BLM is aware that local community members support the protection of these tracts from future mineral development. H.R. 5805 aligns with the administration conservation goal, and we support the bill. Finally, USGS has submitted a statement for the record on H.R. 3681. If you have questions on that bill, USGS is happy to respond to them in writing for the record. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ned. I want to remind the members of the committee, both that are here and that are watching it remotely, that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask our first panel. I'm going to recognize myself first. Mr. Ned, it's good to see you again. And I want to talk about categorical exclusions. When it comes to categorical exclusions for geothermal exploration, not only am I not opposed to the idea, I think in this case it could be a valuable process for both land managers and stakeholders to improve the permitting process. But I'm not clear, I have some concerns about the way the bill proposes to go about it. I start off from the premise that my preference would be for BLM to follow its well-established process so that we can get it right, instead of a blanket exclusion outlined in this bill. Can you explain to us the process that BLM would follow to determine if a categorical exclusion is appropriate? For example, I'll give you 3 parts. Would stakeholders have an opportunity to weigh in? What are the benefits of following this well-established process rather than just a blanket exclusion? And just so we're clear, if BLM was to determine that a categorical exclusion is appropriate for certain exploration activities, does that mean that the entire process of permitting a geothermal project is exempt from environmental review? Can you explain those 3 issues? Mr. Ned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The current process BLM uses right now would review existing practices to incorporate public feedback. BLM would look at a historical record to understand what are the impacts, what are the feedback we're getting from the public, and how to create a categorical exclusion that, again, protects resources and does it in an environmentally sound way. In terms of whether or not a categorical exclusion would allow no further neither, that is not the case. The categorical exclusion would apply to the testing, but NEPA would be required for production and utilization beyond the test. So categorical exclusion would be limited for that purpose, and in the post-leasing would just apply to exploration or the testing.
Thank you for that answer. I have one other question. I don't know if we're going to get to the full answer. BLM was given some new authorities in the Energy Act of 2020. BLM is putting them to good use so that we can responsibly expand renewable energy on public lands, including new transmission projects. Another part of the Energy Act of 2020 was a requirement for BLM to submit annual reports to Congress on the status of the renewable energy program and challenges that you're facing. In the first report that we received earlier this year, BLM highlighted an issue related to geothermal permitting and cost recovery authorities. Could you explain a bit more about the challenges that you've reported on? Is this authority that BLM already has for other types of energy development? What would be the benefits of giving BLM this additional authority? And would Congress have to enact this change through legislation, or is this something that BLM could put into place by itself?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, part of what we explained was our limited resources for processing application. And so right now, we're looking at cost recovery as an authority that could help the BLM utilize its resources on leasing and permitting of geothermal. In terms of whether or not we have that authority, that is something we're exploring internally. However, we always says congressional direction is helpful in terms of using these tools. In terms of how it would help the public, it would help to manage taxpayer dollars. It would help us better utilize the taxpayer dollars. It would also ensure only serious application are going through or coming before the BLM. So again, having this in place would be helpful.
Thank you. I now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes of questions. Representative Stauber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Ned, good to see you again, and thank you for joining us. In 2019, you testified before the Senate Committee on Energy and Minerals Resources in opposition to the Buffalo Tract Protection Act, stating, in quote, "Federal minerals will play an important role in providing materials to meet the future population demands for infrastructure in the area," end quote. Now, you testify in support of the bill. I'd also like to note the headlines on the poster that's behind me. In October of 2020, then candidate Joe Biden stated he wanted to use domestic miners to meet our needs for critical minerals. Then in May of 2021, as President Joe Biden said, he now prefers foreign miners and foreign resources. Your position change and testimony are unfortunately consistent with the highest levels of government and portray the Biden administration's open hostility to domestic jobs and embrace foreign resources. I've asked Secretary Haaland this question as well. What changed? Why this abrupt shift to opposing responsible domestic production?
Thank you, Ranking Member, for the question. Again, I am here to represent the administration position, and I've had the opportunity to serve 5 administrations. So again, the president.
Excuse me, is it the administration that's opposing and not you personally? You're just carrying the message to us?
As a career member, I implement the policies of the administration, and so my job as a career civil servant is to represent the administration regardless of which administration is in place, their policies and their position.
In 2019, President Trump was in office. You testified on his behalf in support of domestic critical minerals, is that correct?
At the time, the administration position was that.
And you testified on behalf of President Trump's support for domestic critical minerals. And now you're supporting the Biden administration.
Now I am presenting to you the administration position on this bill, Ranking Member.
So would you say the administration's positions have changed?
What I would say is the administration has a policy direction, and I am presenting you with their policy direction and their position.
And it's changed from domestic mining to foreign, from domestic mining of critical minerals under the Trump administration to outsourcing for our critical minerals to foreign nations, some that are adversarial. Mr. Ned, we are a year and a half into the Biden administration. Gas prices have been at an all-time high, yet 0 leases have been issued by this administration. When, and I'm putting you on record here, will those leases won at the recent onshore sale, when will they be conveyed to the leaseholders?
Again, thank you for the question, Ranking Member. Those leases will be conveyed as the BLM work through the process now that we've conducted some lease sale to issue those leases.
And can you give us a time frame?
As I sit here today, I do not have a time frame, but I know the Bureau is working expeditiously to complete that process.
Could you say 1 month? Or 1 year?
Again, we're working as fast as we can with the resources to work through the process to issue those lease, Ranking Member.
The Mineral Leasing Act requires lease sales to be held quarterly. Only one has been held, and you are now 5 quarters behind. What is the status for the next round? And again, I'm putting you on the record. And when can we expect those to be held?
Thank you for the question. Right now, we're continuing to receive nomination. We're processing those. And as we get through the process, we will then announce a date for the next lease sale.
Do you have any time frame?
Again, interest, and it's as parcels are nominated, we work through that. And once those parcels are cleared and complete the process, we will announce that, Ranking Member.
And of course, there's no time frame on it. You are aware you're 5 quarters behind, correct?
I am aware that we're presenting parcels once they're ready for leasing.
Thank you. And again, 5 quarters behind. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I now recognize Representative McCollum for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Ned, first I want to thank you for your years of service. We truly appreciate them. And for the committee members, just to remind some of the challenges that have been happening with BLM well over a decade. BLM has been, its budget hasn't seen and kept up with inflation. Under President Obama, we had great difficulties. I'm on the Appropriations Committee that oversaw the funding for BLM. Great difficulties, even in the time when we were trying to do more gas and oil leases, especially for tribal nations. We had great difficulty in keeping up with the budget. The other thing that was happening to BLM was the recruitment from some of the folks who could do the paperwork, do the inspection work with the people who were looking to do the license, because they could make so much more money in the private sector. Mr. Chair, someone's microphone is on. So much more money in the private sector that BLM just saw folks leave. And then the last straw, I think, on the BLM's back, because Mr. Ned's here doing his job, and to ask him to give certain dates where he can do things might sound reasonable, but in light of the funding and the turmoil in the BLM was uprooted from its offices here in Washington, D.C., against the will of Congress. It was done executively. Leases were broken, and there's reports on what took place. And we had another mass exodus of retirements for people who didn't want to locate their families all the way across the country. So the BLM is an organization where we have some fabulous people who have worked through some terrible times with great uncertainty, and they have not been funded and resourced in the way that they should be to provide the services for the American people. So, Mr. Ned, I'm not asking you to comment any more than, did I kind of give a little bit of a description about what's been happening in the BLM? Some of the turmoil, the turnover, the circumstances, the move, all have affected your ability to do the job that you and the employees at BLM want to do for the American taxpayer?
You have, Congresswoman, and thank you for that.
I want to get back to geothermal. This is something that when I was in the Minnesota State House on our Department of Natural Resources Committee, both authorizing and financial, we were moving on in the 1990s. One of the concerns that we had with geothermal was not using it. We were excited about using it, but the open and closed loop systems, the inspections, making sure that we had certified people who understood what they were doing, because if you don't get the system right, you can do a lot of destruction, in fact, to other nearby water systems. Is that part of the permitting process that you're working on with on federal lands to make sure that it is done by people who have the proper amount of training? Because we need, and I want to work with anybody on more workforce in the trades to do that. Is that one of the challenges that you're facing?
Yes, Congresswoman, certainly having technical expertise with the right training and the understanding is a very important part to ensure it's done in an environmentally safe manner.
Well, Mr. Chair, we need to work with the education, health, and labor folks, and we need to get, these are fabulous union jobs, and, we need to let people know that they're out there and help encourage and help subsidize training with trades and labor the way that we do currently with college. One other thing I would just like to point out, Mr. Chair, in the bill that we had before the committee last week, there was nothing in the bill that prohibited taconite mining. I know the ranking member has a different opinion to go with his talking points, but there was nothing in that bill that prohibited it. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chair, and I thank you for the time.
Thank you, Representative McCollum. I now recognize Representative Harrell for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Ned. I do have a couple of questions more specifically to HR 5805. Obviously, I'm from New Mexico, so I'm interested in hearing more about this particular bill. But I know the department has made a goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And so that's part of, I think, the policy-making process for you. But I find it curious that the aggregate companies that are close to the developers and the users, the end users, if we close these down, then we'd actually have to be trucking more aggregates in, which would actually increase emissions in an area like Albuquerque. So I just find that these are truck-served markets, not rail-served, so I feel like when we have to move that material much further, then we obviously risk increasing emissions, especially, it seems a little counterproductive when the department's wanting to go net, zero. But I'd like to ask, so how does the department support this legislation and the inevitable increase in emissions it would cause with the department's goal to reach that net zero emissions?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. It is a careful balance, and BLM, in managing its resources, pays attention to the community, pays attention to the people that live in the area, and we have clearly heard from the community of the impacts mining is having on them. And so it's finding that careful balance to make certain that we can protect the resources while protecting people's lives and their community.
Mr. Ned, have there been town halls or communications with residents?
I have not personally, but I know my field office, our New Mexico staff, have had much communication with the community. And as you know, this process has been going on for a few years. And so, yes, I think there's all variation of communications.
And the business owners that utilize these aggregate materials, have they been involved with these conversations? Because it feels as though we're looking to shut down industry, and I'm very concerned about the number of jobs, the availability of product. Does the BLM know where the aggregates are that would be accessible if this were shut down? Where would the next set of aggregates come from for these projects in the Albuquerque area?
Yes, Congresswoman, we're aware there are 2 additional sites in the area on private land, and it's our understanding that those lands may be used for that. I don't have any specific beyond that.
Because I'm understanding that they're not accessible mainly because they're either directly adjacent to or under Albuquerque or Rio Rancho or on tribal lands or private property. So there are, I think, some limitations. I think we have to be very careful about hamstringing materials that are so valuable for so many products for our builders in a state like New Mexico. I'm concerned that, when we look at the bipartisan infrastructure law, but then when we make aggregates off limits for production of some of these projects that we know are in the infrastructure bill, it seems like it's counterproductive again to hamstring the materials, the availability of these materials, or chance, in fact, producing more emissions to move these materials into a remote location or even a state like Albuquerque or New Mexico. But I would be remiss also not to just tap onto something my colleague mentioned about the lease cells. I know BLM recently had a lease cell in the state of New Mexico. It was only for 6 parcels, which is just a small portion of what it actually could have been. it's unacceptable, really, when we're looking at energy prices at record level highs. You know, inflation over 9%, people paying more at the gas pump than they ever have before. And I'm just curious as to the concern and the question as why only 6 parcels in that lease cell instead of traditionally it's been 10 or 20 times that.
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. Certainly, the nominations, the BLM will review them and process it and finding a careful balance. And while we realize nomination may be numerous, again, it's trying to strike that balance for the protection of resources while at the same time continuing the president's effort to develop resources right here at home.
So develop resources right here at home, though, wouldn't we want to increase the parcel sizes?
Again, having the parcels that is met the process, going through the process, having parcels that carefully does not impact the environment, that is the balance the administration is striking. And so, again, we've been able to put up parcels not only in New Mexico, but in other states.
Great. Thank you very, very much. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Harrell. I now recognize Representative Stansbury for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and also to the ranking member. And thank you so much for the opportunity this morning to discuss this legislation. And thank you, Mr. Ned, for your service and also for being here with your testimony today. The Buffalo Tract legislation is named for the shape of one of 4 parcels of land the communities in New Mexico's 1st Congressional District have been fighting for decades to protect and have withdrawn from further mineral development. Sandoval County, New Mexico has 6 gravel mines, including 4 of the state's largest already in the area. These communities have been fighting for decades to protect these tracts from multinational companies who are seeking to come in and build a deeply unpopular gravel mine that will further pollute these communities and the surrounding landscape. Let me be clear, these lands are sacred. They are ancestral to the surrounding Pueblo tribes whose stories and history are tied directly to these lands. These lands are a vital wildlife corridor between 2 mountain ranges and the Rio Grande River. These lands are adjacent to the community of Placitas and Las Huertas land grant and will be heavily impacted. Over the last year, I have crisscrossed my district and, yes, held town halls in the community of Placitas, and I have heard from hundreds of New Mexicans that are deeply concerned about this and other similar issues. In fact, last week, I was fortunate enough to meet with the governor and leadership of Santa Ana Pueblo, who shared about the historical and cultural importance of these ancestral lands, which are tied to the origins of the Pueblo itself. When I speak to the residents of Placitas, Santa Ana, San Felipe, Bernalillo, and the other communities that are nearby, they are clear and unified in opposition to the development of these lands. In fact, when BLM released their draft resource management plan in 2012, the community mounted an unprecedented response, submitting more than 17,000 public comments in opposition to mining on these tracts. This number represents thousands more than actually even submitted comments, 17,000 public comments in opposition to the development of these lands. Our local leaders, our tribal leaders, our residents are gravely concerned about the cultural, environmental, and public health impacts of this development. The location is especially dangerous as it's intermixed with residential areas and the cumulative impacts of existing mines. It is an extremely beautiful landscape that has significant cultural importance and has doubled its population size since 1992. It provides a wildlife corridor for deer, elk, wild turkey, and pronghorn antelope that connects the Sandia and Sangre de Cristo mountains. And these lands are Pueblo lands that have ancestral and important histories also tied to our land grants. Sand and gravel mining in the area has already stripped the surrounding landscape. It is clear this is not the right area for new development, and the Bureau, in fact, has already identified that there are ample supplies of gravel in surrounding and other sites in order to meet the needs of the Albuquerque area and other surrounding areas in New Mexico. We do not need to be mining in culturally and environmentally sensitive areas. The community has said it loud and clear. They do not want these mines and the false economic promises that come with them. It is criminal and unconscionable to put profits and the bottom line of multinational corporations between the cultural, historical, and environmental well-being of our communities. And that is why we have introduced this legislation, because legislative withdrawal is the best way to protect these lands permanently and to do exactly what we were asked to do when we were elected, which is to listen to and act on the will of our communities. Mr. Ned, I deeply appreciate your testimony and the BLM and Department of Interior's testimony in support of this legislation. Madam Secretary Deb Haaland championed this bill and carried this bill when she sat in this seat herself, a descendant of a pueblo in New Mexico. I know that the department is committed to listening to our tribes and our pueblos, but I would like to ask you here today to reaffirm that commitment, that you will listen to our communities and do everything in your power administratively and legislatively to protect these lands.
Absolutely, Congresswoman.
Thank you very much. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I cede back.
Thank you, Representative Stansbury. I now recognize Representative Graves from the great state of Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ned, thank you for being here. I understand you have about 30 years of service with BLM as a career employee, and I appreciate that long, distinguished career. I want to ask you a question. I spend a good bit of time at home back in South Louisiana, and just increasingly the number of people that I run into who tell me stories about just the inability to pay their electricity bills, fuel their car, even buy groceries. Knowing that we've actually, during the Obama administration at this point in time, we'd had 50 lease sales. In this administration, effectively, we've had none. The one court-ordered lease sale that hasn't really come to fruition. What message would you give to those people that can't afford to pay their energy bills when you're well aware, because of your distinguished career, that we have the energy resources in the United States and we're not producing them?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. The message I would give, it's a careful balance. Balancing the development of energy resources while protecting communities, while protecting the environment is always a careful balance. And as we learn more about the environment, as we learn more about the resources, we have to take a balanced approach to that.
But Mr. Ned, there's no balance right now. There's no balance because we're not producing energy. And you're well aware strictly from a numbers perspective, this energy is still being demanded, which is why the president was in Saudi Arabia last week asking them to produce more energy. So the energy is needed. And if we're going to consider balance, Mr. Ned, then shouldn't we produce energy here where we do it safer and it generally has lower emissions than other sources, particularly in the offshore?
Well, Congressman, energy is still being produced here in the United States, and looking at more than 1 billion barrels of oil was produced here, an all-time record high from federal
But Mr.
land.
Ned, let's not distort this question, though. Clearly, there is a supply and demand imbalance, and that we've had the highest sustained increase in energy prices ever. Folks cannot afford to pay their electricity bills. They cannot afford to fuel their car. What message do you give to those people knowing that we're not producing domestic energy where we can do it cleaner and safer, yet prices are going up as a result of these flawed policies? Mr. Ned, let's be honest, there's not a balance right now, and I think we both know that.
I think the message I would say, there's 9,000 permits available to industry to develop
And Mr.
right
Ned,
now.
Look, I'm really disappointed that you're doing this because we both know that there's a higher percentage of those permits being produced right now than ever before, and those permits is not, just getting the APD approval does not mean that you can produce energy. Mr. Ned, I know you're well aware of this. I know you're well aware of the litigation. I know you're well aware of the fact that this administration is taking longer to approve other permits than any administration administration. So we can sit here and discuss this and we can play games, but you're not answering the question. And there's not a balance that's going on right now. This administration's policies are entirely responsible for those prices. And Mr. Ned, being a career employee of Department of Interior, and you've seen different energy policies, you've seen different balance being struck, and the message to those people at home should be nothing else other than this is failed energy policy that's forcing you into poverty and making false choices between paying electricity bills, fueling your vehicle, buying groceries and other things. And it's really unfortunate that our own administration is imposing these costs, is imposing this crisis on American citizens. I'm just incredibly disappointed. I want to pivot, once again, Mr. Chairman, I want to make note that we're not actually proposing energy solutions today. In fact, we're talking about policies that would withdraw lands. So Mr. Ned, you just mentioned the balance. One of the bills, H.R. 5805, would permanently ban the development of natural resources on 4,200 acres of BLM land. BLM land, which we own for the purpose of management, production, not for other purposes. It would result in more affordable and lower emission sources of sand and gravel. I'm sitting in the Transportation Committee right now with Secretary Buttigieg, where virtually every question has been about inflation, supply chain, labor costs and everything, and how they can't afford to build projects that they had previously planned on building. So why would we shut down a source of sand and gravel that's domestic, that's cheaper, that's lower emissions if we're trying to actually build infrastructure?
Congressman, again, the balance that I speak about is listening to communities, listening to the people in those areas, and there is sand and gravel available in other parcels within that area. So that is the balance we have to strike.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back here, but Mr. Ned, I want to thank you. I have a feeling if we were outside the room or if I gave you about this much beer, your answers would be a little bit different than you just gave on the record. You're not going to get fired by the administration today, but I also think that there were probably some more truthful answers that could have come out in regard to striking that right balance, and I hope we have an opportunity to discuss this a bit more in the future. Yield back.
Thank you, Representative Graves. I now call upon Representative McEachin. I recognize for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for pulling together today's hearing. Mr. Ned, as others have done, let me thank you for being here with us today. And I'd like to turn your attention to a bill that's already been raised, I think, a couple times, 5805, the Buffalo Tract Protection Act. My understanding is that the local communities support protecting these lands from future mineral development. And that's exactly what this bill would do. Can you speak to how the Bureau works with local communities to ensure that community needs are met and that community voices, particularly those from marginalized communities, are heard during the process?
Thank you, Congressman. During our process, we have comment periods. We host town halls or public type meeting, and we pay attention to communities. And in this case, the community has been loud and clear about the impacts mining has been having on them, and the community has asked for us to listen to them to cease any additional mining development. Again, we understand that within the area there are other sources on private property for development. So it's listening to communities, listening to people who live and work there, listening to people who are being impacted by the type of extraction that is going on.
I want to direct your attention to, and it may not be any different. There may not be any difference in this particular community, but what about the marginalized communities? What do you do to make sure that you're listening to them, whether it's in this particular piece of legislation or in general?
Thank you, Congressman. Making certain that we, again, meet the community in ways that they can communicate with us. For instance, in community where we may post additional information not only on the network, but in the newspapers. Again, hosting local meetings in those communities, listening to whether it's the civic clubs. And so it's a case by case, but we try to reach those community in ways that they can communicate with us.
Uh, Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I'm going to give you 2 minutes back. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative McEachin. I now recognize Representative Tiffany for 5 minutes of questions. Representative Tiffany.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I really appreciate the author's comments in regards to we must legislate this issue. I would submit to this entire committee, it's a similar thing that we need in regards to wolves here in America, that we need legislation that will bring back control to the states for them to be able to manage their wildlife populations. I see this as a real parallel. Would love to work with you in the future to be able to accomplish that also. Mr. Ned, there's a geothermal bill before us here. Do you support that bill?
Thank you, Congressman. We support the goals of the bill.
Yeah, okay. So if in here I'm reading HR 5350 would reduce the regulatory hurdles, and if that's a good thing to do, shouldn't we do that for all of NEPA? Shouldn't we do that for all the regulatory processes that we have here in America? If it's to bring additional energy sources to Americans, shouldn't we do that generally, not just for one activity like geothermal?
I think, Congressman, we should take a careful look at the process and figure out efficient ways to complete that process or develop energy, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Ned. I find it so curious that we see this where we have to have these exclusions for certain things when we just don't go out and reform NEPA as it really needs to be, when we're seeing construction projects taking 15 to 20 years to complete. It's unconscionable. You wonder why America's getting in a tough spot here when it comes to utilization of natural resources, and it's leading to much higher costs for consumers, inflation. It's a big part of it. Mr. Ned, how many acres has the Biden administration proposed to withdraw from use here in the United States since President Biden was sworn in January 20th of 2021?
Congressman, I don't have that number right here. I would be glad to take that question and get back to you.
Would you say it's in thousands of acres?
Again, I don't have that number.
Millions? We'd really like to get that number. I'd like to know what that number is, and Mr. Chairman, I would submit that to you also. We should find out how many acres are being proposed to be withdrawn from being able to use by the American people. This is their lands that could be used to rein in inflation, high energy costs. We could stop burning down our forests across America. Mr. Ned, to your knowledge, does the Bureau of Land Management support a reduction in carbon emissions? Is that a policy goal?
I'm sorry, what was the question, Congressman?
Does the Bureau of Land Management support a reduction in carbon emissions?
To my knowledge, yes.
Okay. Will this action with Buffalo Tract, will this action reduce emissions?
Again, we're carefully balancing and we're going through a process right now to complete that plan, so I cannot definitively give you an answer here. But we do know as we go through that process, we're looking to balance resource protection with the needs of the community.
So if they have to truck these materials a further distance to be able to help build homes in this area, in reading testimony, I see there's very high-end homes. Wealthy people are moving from other states to this area. That was cited in there. I'm sure they want to have really nice amenities, good driveways, and all the rest. I mean, doesn't that take trucks and energy to be able to move those things, to be able to build those homes?
I think carbon emission is from a variety of sources. And so again, looking at all the sources and trying to do what is right for the community and what is in the best interest of resources.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like we have a NIMBY situation here. Where people want all the good things, but boy, don't do it in my backyard. Let's be real clear here. This administration, since January 20th of 2021, when their very first action was to shut down energy production here in America, and they've been doing it ever since. It has been an unmitigated disaster. And you look at governmental policies that have been going on in administrations, both Democrat and Republican, for the last couple decades, are really doing great harm to Americans. Look at what's happening in New Mexico. Are those fires still going on at this point? I mean, think about it. Those fires were set by a governmental agency. Why aren't we having hearings about that? Let's have a hearing about why New Mexico is being burned down as a result of the negligence of a federal agency. And we've seen this in the past with the great, the spill that happened, what was that, up in Colorado? I can't remember which state that happened in. And we see a state like New Mexico being burned down. We're seeing blackouts and all the rest. Strike a balance. This administration has not done it in any way, shape, or form as we suffer with inflation and high energy prices. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Tiffany, Representative Tiffany. And I want to thank Mr. Mr. Nebb for your valuable testimony and members for this round of questions. But this concludes our first panel. Mr. Ned, members may have some additional questions for you. And we ask that you respond to them in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit written questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be open for 10 business days for these responses. Mr. Ned, again, thank you. You're free to go if you wish.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm now going to introduce our second panel, our witnesses for our second panel. We may have to stop and recess if votes are called during this panel or during the questioning. I'm going to introduce our witnesses. First, Mr. John Bird, or JB, is the president of the Miller Wenhold Capital Strategies. Mr. Jonathan Arthur is the executive director of the American Geosciences Institute. Ms. Mary Rose de Valadares is the chair of the Land Use Protection Trust in Placitas, New Mexico, and is a member of the Eastern Sandoval Citizens Association and the Las Placitas Association. And Ms. Sarah Jewett is the Director of Strategy for Fervo Energy. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will begin. It will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining. I recommend that members and witnesses joining remotely use the grid view so they may pin the timer on their screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I will allow the entire panel to testify before questioning the witnesses. Mr. Bird, you are recognized for 5 minutes of questions, 5 minutes of testimony.
Great. Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, my name is John J.B. Bird, and I'm president of Miller Wenhold Capital Strategies based in Fairfax City, Virginia. I also serve as government affairs representative for the National Society of Professional Surveyors, NSPS, and handle government relations for USGL. It is an honor to appear before the subcommittee, and I would highlight that my full views on the pending legislation featured today are captured in my written testimony. I would like to recognize my colleagues joining me today, Nikki Hazelbaker, Curtis Stiles, Ty Mills, and John Pelletiello. John hired me back in 2005 and has testified before this subcommittee on numerous occasions. Not joining us today in person, but serving at the highest levels of NSPS leadership are Amanda Allred of Alaska, serving as president, and Tim Birch, serving as executive director. Both NSPS and USGO strongly support H.R. 5522, the Federal Land Asset Inventory Reform Act introduced by Representative Kind of Wisconsin and Ranking Member Westerman of Arkansas. Earlier versions of the bill were unanimously approved by the House Committee on Natural Resources in 2014 and 2017. The FLAIR Act authorizes the Department of the Interior to develop and manage a multi-purpose uniform federal GIS database. This inventory of the Department of the Interior lands would improve land management, avoid wasteful duplication and redundancy, and further the goal of map it once, use it many times. Both NSBS and USGO stand ready to work with Congress to enact H.R. 5522. We respectfully urge the legislation's prompt and favorable consideration. Now on to the first slide. H.R. 3681, the Sinkhole Mapping Act, introduced by Representative Soto and Bilirakis of Florida, directs the United States Geological Survey to establish a sinkhole mapping program. Per the nationwide map here, it is worthy to note that this is a truly nationwide problem that impacts urban, suburban, and rural areas of the country. Airborne LiDAR, which is light detection and ranging, offers enormous potential for mapping sinkholes as it can identify surface clues to underlying formations and pinpoint underground activity. See the next slide, which is an example of my home county of Clark County, Virginia, with an example of Boyce, Virginia, in 1 meter resolution on the LiDAR imagery. In this example, LiDAR found 3 sinkholes using bare earth imagery known as a digital elevation model, or a DEM. Next slide. Such an activity as authorized in H.R. 3681 can fully leverage an existing LiDAR data collection program already managed by USGS, commonly known as the 3D Elevation Program, 3DEP, as codified by Public Law 116-323. The 3DEP coalition, comprised of representatives of a broad cross-section of stakeholders, including nearly 60 organizations, enthusiastically support 3DEP. Next slide. This is an example of images from Goodhue County, Minnesota, just west of the Mississippi River, Red Wing, Minnesota. This 3DEP LiDAR showcases the riverbed in the middle and high bluffs on each side. And if you can toggle between these two slides here, you can see where there's LiDAR and then where you see previous field inspection detection. And clearly you can see that the LiDAR outlines all sorts of formations where there's a linear lineup of sinkholes. And so therefore, the previous way to detect sinkholes was not as precise as LiDAR itself. Next slide. This is an example from an image from Calumet County, Wisconsin, home to over 40,000 depressions and 23,000 culverts. This 3DEP LiDAR image shows a depression and sinkhole near the intersection of 2 roads where the pooling of water via a culvert on the west side of the road on the right created an artificial barrier trapping more water, leading to the sinkhole as deep as 26 feet. Please return to the 3DEP slide. Optimally, USGS views 3DEP to be funded at $146 million annually. USGS is on pace to achieve 100% national coverage by the end of fiscal year 2026. On April 27th, 31 bipartisan members of the House, including several from this committee, sent a letter to their colleagues on the House Appropriations Committee requesting robust funding for USGS 3DEP in fiscal year 2023. Recent House Interior Appropriations Subcommittee report language connects the dots between LiDAR data collection for USGS 3DEP and the importance to the sinkhole mapping within the National Geospatial Program. We look forward to working with the bill sponsors and the committee to make sure that this new sinkhole mapping program within USGS, authorized by H.R. 3681, fully leverages and coordinates LiDAR data collection via USGS 3DEP for sinkhole mapping. This concludes my oral testimony. We appreciate the opportunity to share our views and look forward to answering questions you may have. Thank you very much.
I think we're going to have time, but before we call a recess for one more witness. So I'd like to call on Dr. Arthur, and first, thank you, Mr. Byrd. Dr. Arthur, you're recognized for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back after we vote, which will be fairly quickly, I believe.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, members of the subcommittee, and bill sponsor Representative Soto, for the opportunity to provide this testimony in support of H.R. 3681, the Sinkhole Mapping Act of 2021. My name is Jonathan Arthur. I'm the Executive Director of the American Geosciences Institute, or AGI, a nonprofit federation of geoscience societies representing nearly 250,000 geoscientists. Simply put, the AGI mission is to connect Earth, science, and people. Until August of last year and across the 13 years prior, I served as the State Geologist of Florida and Director of the Florida Geological Survey. I also serve on the Water Science Technology Board of the National Academies. And today, I represent myself in bringing you my perspective on the need for and importance of the Sinkhole Mapping Act of 2021. Sinkholes are areas of subsidence or collapse of the Earth's surface in response to naturally occurring cavities in the subsurface. For the most part, these cavities are formed as rock dissolves over geologic time. Sinkholes form suddenly or slowly, often causing significant damage to homes, private lands, businesses, and infrastructure. It is the cover collapse sinkholes that cause most of this damage, make headlines, and can take lives. As you can see in this first slide, these are examples from Florida and the left side and the upper right, and from Arizona in the lower right, affecting infrastructure as well as a very environmentally sensitive catastrophic collapse in a gypsum stack in Florida and a large sinkhole that impacted infrastructure in Arizona. Landscapes where rocks dissolve into cavities characterized by sinkholes, caves, and springs are called karst. Limestone and dolostone and gypsum are the most common soluble rocks that comprise the foundation of these landscapes. In the next slide, you can see areas, the blue and green are areas where this derivative geologic map shows these carbonate and evaporite deposits. And the red zones are reported sinkhole hotspots, and this is a USGS map. Sinkholes also occur in some volcanic landscapes. The pink area is associated with lava tube collapses in the northwestern US. So again, as you've heard, it's a national issue. In many cases, karst landscapes comprise the surface of prolific aquifers that provide water resources. Thus, the nexus between sinkholes and water resources include their formation, sites for aquifer recharge, and potential routes for contamination or impactful groundwater contamination. Multiple factors control where sinkholes will occur and how fast they will develop. These factors are naturally occurring, such as rock and sediment type, geologic structures, and groundwater levels, and human-induced, such as construction of stormwater ponds, landfills, or groundwater pumping and terraforming. As such, determining risk of sinkhole occurrence is complex and relies on diverse data sets. Slide 3, please. In Florida, for example, such a modeling effort required over $1 million and consideration of multiple geospatial data sets, including soil, subsurface geologic, aquifer water level maps or potentiometric maps, and statewide digital elevation model. Thanks to LiDAR data you just heard about and the 3-DEP program at the USGS, these elevation models are becoming more widely available, and they are highly accurate and precise. To understand where sinkholes have occurred in the past is not only a predictor of where they may occur in the future. For example, changes in groundwater levels due to urban expansion or changing precipitation or drought patterns can influence their distribution. The economic impact of sinkholes is significant. One USGS study reported an average cost of $300 million per year to the economy, which is now likely a low estimate. Moreover, sinkholes are responsible for human deaths. I support the Sinkhole Mapping Act of 2021, and in doing so, I recommend the following: that the development of the maps be accomplished in partnership with state geological surveys and other partners, and I urge consideration of the successful USGS National Cooperative Mapping Program as a model for accomplishing this. And 2, that authorization and appropriation are needed as the task of sinkhole mapping and risk is complex, and appropriate levels of funding will allow this important work to proceed unimpeded and without diluting other priorities. And lastly, that as an enhancement of the bill text, consider including susceptibility alongside risk. Implementation of the act will benefit public health, safety, the economy, and the environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Arthur. Unfortunately, votes have been called, and we're going to need to recess and come right back as soon as we can. We appreciate everyone's patience. This hearing is now in recess subject to the call of the chair, and I hope that all members will return as soon as the votes are complete. This committee is now in recess. Welcome back. We're back. This recess is over. We have voted. Our final votes are not until 4:30. I hope we're not still here until 4:30. And I think our next witness, I think Dr. Arthur was our last witness. Thank you, Dr. Arthur. And thank you, witnesses, for being patient and coming back. And Ms. De Valadares, you're recognized for 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee. On behalf of the Land Use Protection Trust, the Eastern Sandoval Citizens Association, and the Las Placitas Association, thank you for the opportunity to come before the subcommittee to request passage of the Buffalo Tract Protection Act. We are grateful to Representative Stansbury for introducing this legislation. Our community, including the Santa Ana and San Felipe Pueblos, as well as the San Antonio de las Huertas land grant, is in broad agreement that this withdrawal legislation is needed. Because of its natural southwestern beauty and location near Albuquerque, Placitas has become an attractive destination, especially for the retired and semi-retired. The Placitas population quintupled between 1980 and 2010 to 5,000 or so. Private investment drove all this growth, but it is now threatened by gravel mining. Sandoval County had no comprehensive zoning ordinance until 1988. That ordinance permitted only low-density residential and agricultural uses. In 1990, it was expanded to include Placitas. In 1992, the BLM updated its 1986 Rio Puerco Resource Management Plan. However, BLM failed to perform a local consistency review as required by federal law. Consequently, BLM failed to note that Sandoval County had prohibited mining in Placitas. So over 30 years after Sandoval County decided that mining was inconsistent with the rural, residential, and agricultural character of Placitas, the Resource Management Plan still hasn't been updated to recognize this decision, even though BLM agrees with all stakeholders in our community that new mining on the Buffalo Tract would be harmful. For a long time, Placitas has had 4 of the 13 largest gravel mines in New Mexico. These mines harmed our economic development, our public health, and our environment, water, land, air, and wildlife, as well as the cultural heritage and sacred places of this diverse high desert community. And in a 2010 BLM report actually notes that there are alternative sources of gravel in the region where mining could be a benefit and not a burden. A 60-mile band would provide a 90-year supply of aggregate-rich sand and gravel resources, equal or superior to those in the Buffalo Tract. This is more than adequate to cover the needs of New Mexico's slowly growing population. For the record, the New Mexico population, according to the last census, is 2 million. It grew under 3% over the last 10 years, but it is forecast to reach only 2.2 million in the next 20 years. The state has no arrangements with any Placitas mine for any of their materials, having ample resources elsewhere to meet its infrastructure and transport needs. The community is in agreement about the extensive harmful impacts of existing mining. Migration to Placitas has suffered. Property values have suffered, not only of adjacent properties, but throughout Placitas. Sandoval County's tax base has suffered. Residents of the larger Albuquerque area have suffered loss of land for potential low-impact recreation. And we're also now at risk of losing sacred spaces because another mine will only compound all that I've mentioned, as well as the loss of, sacred areas. So the key to the Placitas economy is its natural beauty, but our high desert environment is exceptionally vulnerable. Placitas sits at an elevation of 6,000 feet. We get under 10 inches of rain a year. We're 6 years into a serious drought. We've just gotten 3 inches of rain this year. The landscape is sparsely populated. The roots of the pinon bush, for example, guard against soil erosion and thus play a crucial role in the ecosystem. Pinon can live 600 plus years, but they take 60 plus years to reach just 6 to 7 feet in height. And the winds blow hard from January to June, sometimes up to 60 miles per hour. Mining generates large amounts of dangerous particulate matter. Desert winds can carry PM10 particles as much as 30 miles and PM2.5 particles hundreds of miles. Both pose significant health risks, especially for silicosis. New Mexicans are twice as likely to die of silicosis as the national average. And water is the most precious resource in this high desert environment. The only way for gravel mining industry to attempt to mitigate the public health risks from mining near residential areas is to spray disturbed ground with water. This makes gravel mining hugely water intensive, consuming 3 to 4 times as much water per acre as residential uses in Placitas. The Placitas community has now spent 2 decades trying to work with BLM to update the 1986 Resource Management Plan to end mining. 17,000 written comments have opposed mining, yet the 1986 plan remains in place, and the 2012 draft RMP would continue to allow mining. That's why the Buffalo Tract Protection Act was introduced in Congress. Only Congress can resolve this issue permanently. Happily, the BLM has endorsed passage of the Buffalo Tract Protection Act. We urge the subcommittee to support this withdrawal legislation, which is vitally important to Placitas, Sandoval County, and the state of New Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. De Valadares. Ms. Jewett, you are recognized for 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome to the subcommittee.
Thank you very much, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Stauber, and members of the House Natural Resources Committee, Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing. My name is Sarah Jewett, and I am the Director of Strategy at Fervo Energy. We are a company that develops next-generation geothermal projects that can deliver 24/7 clean, reliable electricity drawn from the heat of the earth. I'm testifying today on behalf of Geothermal Rising, the geothermal industry's leading advocacy group, where I serve as chair of the policy committee. Geothermal Rising's mission is to support the advancement of American-made geothermal energy, leveraging underground thermal resources to generate round-the-clock clean power, creating well-paying jobs, and growing a key part of the strong and reliable grid of the future. Geothermal Rising has nearly 90 corporate members representing 18 states and the District of Columbia. I'm grateful that the committee has convened today in part to examine a critical, albeit difficult issue, permitting for geothermal projects on federal lands. We are in a period of extraordinary opportunity for American-made sources of clean baseload electricity. In the face of steadily worsening climate change, demand for non-weather dependent, renewable, affordable power is soaring. Individual states are seeking to bolster their reliability, reduce cost, and meet aggressive clean energy targets. The Biden administration has mandated that all federal facilities be powered by 50% firm, carbon-emitting free power by 2030, and corporations are voluntarily establishing 24/7 carbon-free electricity goals. As a firm, clean source of power with a uniquely American-made supply chain, geothermal energy is incredibly well-suited to meet this moment. And Fervo and other members of Geothermal Rising are working hard to match sudden increased demand. The DOE's 2019 GeoVision report found that with the right blend of federal incentives and regulatory enhancements, geothermal could provide over 120 gigawatts of electricity by 2050, accounting for 20% of U.S. electricity supply. But in just a few short years since GeoVision's release, substantial technology transfer from the oil and gas industry, combined with aggressive climate targets, have expanded the potential of geothermal energy even further. With the right balance of federal policy and regulation, the geothermal industry could bring new projects online at an unprecedented rate, leading to massive job creation and widespread economic development in new and rural areas of the country. According to the U.S. Energy and Employment Report, the U.S. geothermal industry today supports over 8,000 direct jobs, along with significant indirect and related jobs. As our industry scales to supply 20% of U.S. electricity, job creation is expected to scale commensurately, with the potential to create hundreds of thousands of new jobs. Each one of these new projects will create positions for both union and non-union truckers, dirt movers, surveyors, oilfield equipment operators, steel workers, electrical workers, carpenters, geologists, drilling, mechanical, and electrical engineers, and more, offering reliable, well-paying positions for people who want to join the clean energy economy with very little retraining. With much of the nation's quality geothermal resource existing under federal lands, the permitting process can be a key gating factor to the success of these developments. As an environmentalist and an outdoors woman myself, I believe that renewable energy development on public land should incorporate careful consideration of environmental and community impacts. However, the current NEPA process makes it difficult for developers like Fervo to plan, finance, and build projects effectively, and thus inhibits the growth of our industry. Across multiple critical phases of development, permitting and NEPA timelines are consistent bottlenecks and lacking in transparency, adding uncertainty to an already highly risk-laden process. In order to facilitate widespread geothermal deployment, we believe strongly that there are straightforward steps the federal government must take to increase the efficiency of geothermal permitting while maintaining NEPA's strong framework of environmental safeguards for public lands. With this in mind, we applaud Representative Fulcher for his introduction of H.R. 5350, the Enhancing Geothermal Production on Federal Lands Act. This legislation would take important steps to increase the efficiency of federal leasing and permitting for geothermal projects, bringing significant new clean energy and reliable power resources onto the grid and creating jobs across the country. There are also several additional steps that Congress and the administration could take to support these projects, including expanding the application of casual use reviews and determinations of NEPA adequacy, surging resources for permit processing, and increasing transparency of the permitting process. Along with 5350, Congress and this committee can play a key role in supporting each of these steps, and in doing so, boost an industry that is ready to scale, providing clean power and well-paying jobs across America. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Jewett. I thank the panel for their testimony, and I will remind members that the committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any question they may wish to ask. And so I'm going to recognize myself. And my first question is on the second panel. First, thanking all the panel again for your patience and while we were in recess, and so I'm glad that we're all back now. Ms. De Valadares, how has your community's communication been with the prospective mining company in the region? I know there was some movement after the hearing on the bill last Congress. Has there been any efforts to resolve the community's concerns?
Thank you. Admittedly, it was a rough start when Vulcan, the current mining company at the Placitas pit, took over from the previous company, the French multilateral Lafarge, in 2013. This is because the Lafarge had announced, I guess early in the 2000s, that it was going to sunset in 2015 and the lease was going to end. And so when Vulcan took over, there were just a couple years left on the lease. And what happened here is that when Vulcan took over, they were operating under a grandfathered clause, a non-conforming use, and they violated the non-conforming use, and they were operating 24/7. So Sandoval County sent them a notice of non-conformance and sued them, and at that time, the community joined the lawsuit with the county, the Land Use Protection Trust specifically. And the idea was that we'd been told, the whole community had been told that the mine was going to sunset, and we didn't want another 30 years of mining. So eventually there was a lawsuit, it went to arbitration, and eventually it was settled. But what the result was that Vulcan got 15 more years of mining out of it, and the community has to deal with the results of it. So the other thing that's happened in the last couple years is that the current company, Vulcan, has also done exploratory drilling on the Buffalo Tract. This is the area in question, the area where the community does not want mining. That company is also mining, about 30 years to the north of Placitas. And the Sandoval County, ESCA, and the Land Use Protection Trust interact with the current mining company to monitor their progress. And towards completion of the mine, which is now supposed to sunset in in the big pit, the Vulcan pit in Placitas, that's supposed to sunset in 2027. And also the reclamation is supposed to follow. And the community has been cooperative in this process. I mean, the company has been cooperative and appears to be abiding by the terms of this agreement.
Thank you for that. Dr. Arthur, can you give us an example of where the availability of geologic and geospatial data has significantly influenced the outcome of a major project?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for that question. There are numerous examples, and they are all over the country. For example, in Colorado, a sinkhole study was completed by the Colorado Geological Survey, and the government was looking to relocate a jail facility because of some structural issues, and by using geologic maps, which are basically a source for geospatial data, they become digital and used in geographic information systems and so forth. By considering the surface and subsurface geology, a better facility location was cited, and this is just one of numerous examples where across the country, Florida, for example, the design of landfills is informed by evaluating the land beforehand, before actually placing the landfill, and evaluating the presence or absence of karst potential, sinkhole potential, or anomalies in the subsurface that might be weak. And these inform the design of these landfills. The same thing can be said for pipelines, for highway locations, and the list goes on.
We're almost to the end, so I'd like to ask Mr. Byrd, would you like to add an example of this?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. In your opening remarks, you discussed emergency response, and sometimes a project is actually after an incident. And you could look at 9/11, and where the private sector geospatial firms were tasked with going and flying overhead imagery using infrared imagery to identify at ground zero where were the hot spots under the surface, where were the pockets of gas, where were the pockets of fire, where were we trying to rescue folks in the recovery efforts, and to get that information to emergency responders so they can avoid additional problems and incidents. Another example for Minnesota is the Minneapolis I-35 bridge collapse. Same thing happened. Private sector firm was brought on to do post-disaster imagery of what happened with the collapse to help with the emergency response. Also, that data was given to the National Transportation Safety Board so they could study those kind of effects, what happened to the actual bridge itself in what manner. But it really went to the emergency response folks so they could adapt on the fly, if you will, because they had literally imagery, geospatial data to help them.
Thank you, and I yield back, and I recognize representatives, the ranking member, Representative Stauber, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Chair Lowenthal. Ms. Jewett, thank you for joining us today. Your testimony mentioned the importance of grid resiliency as some states attempt to force a transition too early. Minnesota, for example, is one of those states. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune reported that 40% of our state is going to experience a blackout this year. In our advanced world, this is simply unacceptable. To that end, what advantages does geothermal energy hold compared to other renewables to ensure resiliency of our more and more fragile electric grid, including not requiring a backup power source?
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member Stauber. Geothermal energy is an incredible resource to add to the energy mix because of a number of advantages, actually, compared to other renewable energies that may rely upon weather. First, to speak to your question directly, geothermal draws on heat from the earth, and thus it can produce very consistent energy throughout the day, much like a fossil fuel baseload resource such as coal or natural gas. In some cases, it can even be called upon to provide dispatchable power, meaning that can be turned on and off when it is needed. From an environmental perspective, there are additional advantages. Geothermal has a much greater power intensity per unit area of footprint. Depending on probably the technology applied, companies are able to produce tens of megawatts of energy from a single 10-acre pad rather than having to utilize a much larger land footprint in order to erect a power facility. This will only get better as multi-well pad drilling continues to be applied and more megawatts come online. I would say finally, geothermal has an incredible potential to create jobs at every project site. These are technical and non-technical jobs, labor and union and non-union labor jobs, both temporary and permanent. And when geothermal potential is expanded, the job numbers are pretty staggering.
Thank you very much. So in your testimony, you would agree that geothermal should be part of that, quote, all of the above energy strategy. Would that be correct?
Yes, sir.
To your knowledge, would a categorical exclusion at exploration for geothermal in any way negate NEPA requirements at later stages of development, such as the construction of a power plant?
To my knowledge, the implementation of a categorical exclusion in this context that is proposed would merely allow for geothermal resource confirmation, which is a key portion of geothermal exploration. I would say, in fact, by limiting the diameter of the test wells considered, it actually ensures that a developer must go through a full NEPA assessment process to develop the field in question and subsequently construct a power facility thereafter.
In your testimony, you discussed some of the differences between geothermal energy and other renewables like wind, solar power. Could you discuss any discrepancies you're aware of between geothermal and wind and solar in terms of permitting and review timelines?
Yes, sir. I'm certainly not an expert on recent review timelines for wind and solar, so I can't really speak to that, but I can speak to where the process for permitting for geothermal projects is substantially different than that of wind and solar projects. So like any renewable energy resource, geothermal energy projects must first assess the quality of the resource to determine appropriate project location. Unlike wind and solar, whose resource qualities can be assessed through simple observation of weather patterns, geothermal resource exploration actually requires drilling deep into the earth to understand the types of conditions that exist there. Because the geothermal industry must drill and then drill again to develop the geothermal field, and then separately construct a power plant and grid interconnection, a single geothermal project will typically undergo full NEPA assessment at least 3 times after the lease has been acquired. And it's important to note that geothermal industry has long been so small that there are few field offices with appropriate expertise to process a geothermal permit, which can lead to really long delays of each phase of the NEPA process.
Well, thank you very much, and my time is up. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ranking Member Stauber. I now recognize Representative Stansbury for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also to the ranking member for allowing me to be here on this subcommittee today and for hearing this legislation. As we discussed earlier, this legislation is vital to our communities and protecting their cultural heritage as well as the environmental health and well-being of the Placitas and greater Sandoval County area. I also want to thank Ms. Valadares for your testimony and for being with us today. And I want to thank all of the members of our communities from the Placitas Coalition to the Land Use Protection Trust, Las Placitas Association, Eastern Sandoval Citizens Association, Sandoval County, Santa Ana Pueblo, San Felipe Pueblo, San Antonio de las Huertas Land Grant, Pathways, and the Placitas Chamber of Commerce, who have literally been fighting this fight for years. And of course, I would like to thank our amazing Governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham, for her sustained engagement and her work with our communities on this issue. We have incredible leadership, and as I spoke earlier, our communities are clear that they oppose any development of these lands because of their cultural and environmental significance. I also want to take a moment to dispel a myth, and actually a series of myths that were propagated during the first panel on this hearing, which is that the development activities that would be proposed on this area is not for critical minerals, which is a technical name given to minerals that are used in a whole slew of electronics and other manufacturing processes, and which, yes, of course, have national security implications for the United States. The prospective permits for this land are for sand and gravel. There are multiple surrounding tracts that are already developed that have sufficient supplies to meet the local sand and gravel. The development of these lands would destroy millennial cultural sites. We do not need to destroy cultural sites to mine land and gravel in the state of New Mexico. I also want to dispel another myth, which is about the climate implications of not permitting this particular set of mines. As I said, there are surrounding mines all throughout this area, and in fact, if you've ever driven from Albuquerque to Santa Fe, you will see those mines and the turnoffs to them all around this site. There is plenty of mining sites within the Albuquerque metro area, and this activity will not only not have significant impacts on climate change in terms of transportation, it will retain the ecological value of the existing thousands of acres of land, which are a carbon sink. So I want to be clear about the value of these lands and what we're actually talking about here. We're talking about protecting lands that have been a pathway for wildlife, that have been a pathway for our Pueblo and historic communities since time immemorial, and which are the lands of which around which our communities live. And Ms. de Valadares, I want to just take the opportunity for you to speak a little bit more about what the community feels is really necessary to protect these lands and ensure that for generations we're able to ensure that these lands are not developed.
Thank you, Representative Stansbury. The community is united in its opposition to additional mining on the Buffalo Tract, and we have been actually working on this for 24 years. So what does that mean to us? Well, I can talk about economic and environmental impacts, and I'd also like to just mention for the benefit of the subcommittee that I am by original training a city planner myself. So I have great sympathy for the development process as well. But the economic development impacts of another mine are going to include decreased in-migration, and this is a small area. We're talking about a place with 2 million people altogether. And if we decrease in migration, we're also going to be reducing the tax base. We've already reduced property values in the area because of the mines, and this is consistent with scholarly research. The properties within a 5-mile distance, and that includes all of Placitas, are going to be negatively impacted and subject to economic loss. There's paltry job creation associated with these mines. There's 4 jobs at this 1,000-acre pit that I talked about earlier. There's scant sale revenue to Sandoval County. The local county derives little to nothing because most of the sales occur in Albuquerque to the south, in a different city and in a different county. But the county of Sandoval has to bear the cost of the road infrastructure. And of course, then there's the environmental impacts to public health, which simply cannot be underestimated because particulate matter is very serious. And then there's water, the depletion of the scarce water supply. Water is a big topic of conversation in the Southwest. It's a daily conversation by everyone who lives there. And so the use of these scarce resources to try to tame gravel mining when it's really sort of ineffective is a waste.
Thank
There's
you, Ms.
also the
Valladares. Thank you so much. We're out of time for my lines of questions, but I just want to reiterate that the economic costs of this are actually higher than any proposed economic benefits. Very few jobs, very little economic benefit to our community, and I guarantee that almost all of the profits that would be made from a potential mine would be exported out of our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Stansbury. I now recognize Representative Fulcher for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Lowenthal and the Ranking Member Stauber for allowing me to participate in this hearing. Before my questions, please accept these words in testimony of H.R. 5350, the Enhancing Geothermal Production on Federal Lands Act, that I'm introducing with Idaho Senator Jim Risch on the Senate side. And by the way, it's not a coincidence that we are from Idaho, as Boise, the capital city, has the oldest and largest geothermal heating system in the United States. And that system was initiated back in 1890. So we've got a long history there. Our Idaho state capital is the only capital in the nation that's fully heated with geothermal system. But we are at a crossroads on the roadmap to the future of American energy. The majority party has a high level of opposition to every major energy source in America. Opposition to the harvesting of fossil fuels and the burning of coal. Opposition to harvesting the critical minerals necessary for batteries, windmills, and solar panels. Opposition to dams, which of course limits hydroelectric sources, and the opposition to nuclear power. If we were to accept all of those policy positions, that would mean one of two things would have to happen. Either we purchase expensive energy harvested irresponsibly from people that generally don't like us, or we go without electricity. Understandably, Americans are concerned about the energy challenges of the future, but there is one energy source that, at least so far, has not come under heavy criticism, and that's geothermal. Geothermal energy production on federal lands has some real potential to help us meet our future energy needs. And H.R. 5350 would help streamline the permitting process for potential geothermal projects. I appreciate the BLM in providing feedback, and I look forward to working with my colleagues to make this into law. I do have a couple of questions for Ms. Jewett. Ms. Jewett, you spoke about how geothermal energy, the industry for geothermal is ready to scale, but we all know that investment requires certainty. And I wanted to just ask you how you think a streamlined exploration process under NEPA just might help provide some of that certainty for investment.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question, and thank you also for being such an advocate for our industry. Not only is there incredible heating potential in Idaho's geothermal resources, but there's also incredible electricity generation potential underneath Idaho. I think to answer your question, I think it's really important to sort of dive into what is the process for a geothermal development project. Typically, you can think of it in three phases. First, exploration, which includes trying to find and confirm a temperature resource. Second is development of the propensity of the wells that will provide energy to a project. And third is construction, which includes construction of pipelines for steam or hot water, construction of power facilities, and construction of interconnection tie lines to the grid. Each one of these processes today undergoes the heavy burden of a full-blown NEPA process. An exploration process is not guaranteed to yield a productive development. So the legislation that you have proposed here proposes to reduce the burden of NEPA on that exploration process. When an operator does have some flexibility to be able to explore using low impact activities, they become more capable of trying out different places and confirming where a resource exists in order to pave the way for a larger project and a full-blown NEPA process in the future.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to go to a quote here in the minute that we have remaining. And it's a quote from Section 390 of the Environmental Policy Act 2005. That certain categorical exclusions were approved for the oil and gas industry that were credited with fostering an extremely positive feedback loop between exploration, development, and deployment of unconventional shale resources. So that's obviously the oil and gas industry that was referring to. But if given the same opportunity, what kind of industry growth, if any, could you see this legislation potentially help generate?
think Section 390 of the Environmental Policy Act of 2005 are very consistently credited with fostering really widespread unconventional oil and gas development in the United States. And if you look at the graphs of development, there was certainly an inflection point after the passage of those categorical exclusions. Similar categorical exclusions can go an incredibly long way in fostering geothermal development on federal lands in the United States, helping this industry scale and creating massive jobs across the country.
Ms. Jewett, thank you so very much for your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Before we conclude this panel, are there any members who have not had their 5 minutes and who seek recognition to ask questions now? Seeing as there are not, then I want to thank our witnesses for your valuable testimony and for the members for their questions. The members of this committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.